Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. A few weeks ago, I was absolutely thrilled to see a special video announcing a new month-long theme reading put together by the incomparable Michael K Vaughan. I was thrilled to see Michael K Vaughan's exciting announcement about Sumerian September, the particular epic he recommends about a hero named Conan is unfamiliar to me. So I decided to start off this theme month by reading one of my own Sumerian favorites, Gilgamesh. And so have a whole lot of other people over the millennia. This work is among the earliest written stories we have. One of the key questions in Gilgamesh, a question I see as a similarity between Michael K Vaughan's choice of reading material and my own, is that both pieces of literature are interested in what makes people civilized and what makes them, well, barbarians. The Epic of Gilgamesh begins with a scene describing the city of Uruk. The reader is told to take out a copper box, unlock it, and open its lid, and remove the tablet of lapis lazuli, which will reveal the story of the great king Gilgamesh. The story of this hero is one of the oldest written stories in the world, at least one of the oldest ones we know about at this point. The epic has roots in a real king named Gilgamesh, or so it seems, a king of the city Uruk in ancient Mesopotamia, possibly as early as 2750 BCE. In this fertile crescent between the rivers Tigris and Euphrates began what may have been the earliest writing system in the world, cuneiform. Cuneiform was constructed with marks made on clay tablets with a reed stylus. The earliest markings were used to keep track of agricultural products and food stores, but soon people began to use written language to record stories. These early authors had an instinct to create narratives about what it means to be human. The story of Gilgamesh comes to us on shards of those clay tablets, incomplete, but with more and more found even really recently. The earliest shards date to 2100 BCE and were written in Cimmerian. Later records are in the Akkadian language, some from around 1700 BCE, and some apparently copies made for the world's earliest library from about 650 BCE. Our hero Gilgamesh is one part human and two parts God. Now that's a curious thing. Did the creators of this story know more than we do about the mysteries of the gods, or less than we do about genetics stemming from having two parents? Anyway, this special admixture makes him a glorious hero, large in stature and shining with powerfulness. As the translator Stephen Mitchell says, he was, quote, surpassing all kings, powerful and tall beyond all others, violent, splendid, a wild bull of a man, unvanquished leader. And he goes on, who is like Gilgamesh? What other king has inspired such awe? At the beginning of the epic, Gilgamesh is a tyrannical ruler who sees himself as superior to everyone around him. He abuses his subjects by being the first to have sex with young brides, etc. The people of Uruk cry out to heaven for relief from their king, and the gods answer the call by creating a friend for Gilgamesh, a double or second self for Gilgamesh, as Stephen Mitchell says in his translation. That friend, Enkidu, is designed to distract Gilgamesh from his abusive ways. When we meet him, Enkidu is a wild man, covered in hair and living with the animals in the woods. Gilgamesh decides it's essential for the safety of his monarchy to civilize the wild man, so he sets forth a plan to turn Enkidu into a human man. How do people become civilized? Invite the hairy beast to tea, read him some Shakespeare and play him some Bach, maybe read to him from the Bible. But Bach and the Bard were not yet around, and neither was the Bible. Gilgamesh, with its roots dating back at least 4,000 years, with variant editions created over the next 1,000 years plus, predated even the oldest parts of the Bible by at least several hundred years, and maybe more. So let's look at the main story. How does Gilgamesh plan to civilize Enkidu? He sends a temple prostitute deep into the woods to have sex with Enkidu. Mitchell's translation says that Shamhat uses her love arts to show Enkidu what a woman is. And they lie together for 7 days, constantly. Actually, the scholar and translator Sophus Helle points out that in 2018, a new fragment of the story was found, which shows that the conjugal marathon lasted twice as long as previously thought. When the Times in the UK, that is, reported the story, the headline was, "Ancient Sex Saga Now Twice as Epic." Anyway, after Enkidu and Shamhat are finished, or rather when, quote, he had had enough, Enkidu can no longer bound after his animal friends. He doesn't have the energy anymore, and they no longer see him as one of them. But the civilization process isn't yet over. Not only must he have sex, but he must also get drunk. After Enkidu drank 7 pitchers of beer, his heart grew light, his face glowed, and he sang out with joy. And with that, he has become fully human. He gets his hair cut, and he bathes. Quote, shining, he looked handsome as a bridegroom. I won't go into all the details, but during the civilizing process, Enkidu goes from living with animals in the wild and eating off the land to controlling animals on the pasture and to living in the city. His journey effectively replicates the progression of human civilization. Shamhat brings Enkidu to Gilgamesh, and the two men each know that the other will become the true, quote, companion of his heart. They will love each other with an intensity that will outstrip the men's relationships with women. While it's not completely clear that the love between the men is erotic or sexual, the implications are fairly high, at least to our modern ears. Actually, in a totally testosterone-laden scene, their deep friendship begins with a brutal fight. Gilgamesh eventually wins, but the two acknowledge each other as peers worthy of one another. The two men leave Uruk to have adventures together. First on the list is killing Humbaba, a monster who isn't threatening anything but merely protecting the cedar forest. Then the goddess Ishtar, the goddess of both sex and violence, more or less, makes advances on Gilgamesh, and he rudely rejects her. Her rage at the rejection, and possibly the god's anger about the slaughter of Humbaba, leads her to send down the bull of heaven. Without divine assistance, Gilgamesh and Enkidu together slay the bull. Enkidu has a series of dreams filled with what he assumes are bad omens. Eventually, he realizes that the gods have decided that one of the two men must die for killing the bull. Enkidu knows that he's the one who will be sacrificed. His health declines over the course of the next few days, and eventually he takes his last breath. Gilgamesh, the man who started the book as a selfish tyrant, now mourns deeply for Enkidu. My beloved friend is dead. He is dead. My beloved brother is dead, he cries. I'll mourn as long as I breathe. I'll sob for him like a woman who has lost her only child. In his moment of grief, Enkidu is everything to him. He's his friend and lover, his brother, his mother. Gilgamesh tears his hair and clothes, and he cries out to nature to mourn with him. He wanders in the wilderness, still weeping because of the loss of his friend. It's from Enkidu's death that Gilgamesh begins to realize that he himself will die. Must I die too, he asks. Must I be as lifeless as Enkidu? Of course, Gilgamesh knew he was mortal before this moment. He even bragged that by slaying Humbaba, he would make a name for himself that would last beyond his own life. Why be afraid, he asked then, since sooner or later death must come? When he said those words, death had no relevance to the king. But then his mirror self, Enkidu, died. Shocked by the sudden realization of what death really means, Gilgamesh travels in search of immortality. After much journeying, he stops at the brewpub at the edge of the world, right there on the outskirts of humanity. And he pours out his heart to the owner. And she warns him that he will not find what he's looking for. You will never find the eternal life you seek. Humans are born, they live, and then they die, she says, as translated by Mitchell. Until the end comes, enjoy your life, spend it in happiness, not despair, savor your food, make each of your days a delight, bathe and anoint yourself, wear bright clothes that are sparkling clean, let music and dancing fill your house, love the child who holds you by the hand, and give your wife pleasure in your embrace. That is the best way for a man to live. But Gilgamesh cannot hear her. What can your words mean, he asks, when my heart is sick for Enkidu who died? He travels on through the dangerous waters of death until he reaches Utnapishti, whom the gods had given eternal life. Gilgamesh shares his tale of grief, and Utnapishti and his wife share why they were given immortality. After hearing how desperate Gilgamesh is, they eventually offer him a plant that will restore youth to anyone who consumes it. Unfortunately, Gilgamesh loses his treasure to a wily snake who gains the ability to shed his skin and become young again. Gilgamesh begins to realize that he must accept not only his friend's death, but his own mortality. He returns to his city, seeing the mighty walls of Uruk and imagining its inhabitants, and enters back into life. He's passed through the lands of solitary grief to emerge more fully human and more civilized. When we started the book, that process of becoming civilized seemed to be Enkidu's trajectory. And instead, we see Gilgamesh making that move himself. When he arrives back home, Gilgamesh gazes upon the gates of his city, seeing it through new eyes. Earlier, the sight of the gates fed his own hubris. Now, though, Gilgamesh feels responsible for his community. He knows that while he will not live forever, his name and his memory can live on whenever people remember him as a good king. Little did he know how long his memory would live on. So there are really 3 dramatically different styles of translators, and there are a ton of especially interesting issues that have come up because of the complexity of translating this particular story. I'm going to basically hold off on that discussion and save it for early in 2024. I have an idea of how to approach that topic that I think may work out. We'll see. But basically, one approach is to be as exact as possible and to acknowledge where there are huge cracks in our understanding. When I say huge cracks, that is sometimes literal. Initially created by making indentations on clay tablets, the Epic of Gilgamesh has come to us in pieces, discovered over time and often quite fractured. Personally, I would suggest that instead of finding the most literal translation, which is itself a complicated thing, which, as I said, I'll get to in the 2024 video, you might start with one of the translations/retellings, possibly written by a poet, especially if you're new to Gilgamesh. I'm sure that one reason I love the Stephen Mitchell translation I've been quoting from today is because it was the first version I read. If you're a mature reader, unconcerned about some relatively graphic sexual scenes, I think it's a wonderful version to read. But I made the mistake of starting the audiobook of this with my then very young son. We were both quite embarrassed. When I say it has some relatively graphic scenes, I'm serious. Here's one relatively minor exchange that I'm not quite too embarrassed to read on BookTube. Quote, "Let me suck your rod while you, quote, caress my jewel." If that bothers you, or the young person or mother you're reading the story with, you might look at David Ferry's translation instead. His version of the above passage reads, "Touch me where you dare not. Touch me here. Touch me where you want to. Touch me here." Certainly this version is just as sensual and just as lusty, but it's slightly more subtle in its language. Ferry's translation overall is quite beautiful. Sometimes I even prefer his poetry, and many scholars prefer his translation because it sticks a bit more closely to the actual text we have at this point, rather than just imaginatively filling in holes quite as much as Mitchell does. Still, the extensive foundation that Mitchell sets in his long introduction makes the Mitchell translation my clear favorite. Another option is the translation by Stanley Lombardo, which I find less overtly poetic than Ferry, but still quite lovely in its plainness. Incidentally, his translation of that lusty line is not something that I would feel comfortable saying aloud, but not because it seems actually erotic in any way. When the line is said in the text, it's when Gilgamesh is heaping abuse and accusations on the goddess of sex and violence who is proposing to him. And Lombardo's wording conveys that specific context of anger quite well. If you're interested in a more detailed history and analysis of the epic, I have 3 books to recommend, all very different from each other. The first is The Buried Book, The Loss and Discovery of the Great Epic of Gilgamesh by David Ferry. Beginning with an extremely detailed account of the archaeological rediscovery of some of the tablets of Gilgamesh during the 1870s, the book then goes back in time to discuss Ashurbanipal's great library in Nineveh during 600s BCE, the Epic of Gilgamesh itself, and finally the history of the real-life King Gilgamesh. Although Ferry develops his historical characters with the pacing of a novelist, I must admit that I got a bit bogged down in the early descriptions of the ins and outs of the 19th century discovery of Gilgamesh. I found the latter sections of the book much more readable and interesting. You might choose to start your reading with chapter 5, and then, after finishing to the end, skim through the beginning chapters. The second book that I'll recommend is a new translation combined with several in-depth essays about both the history of the epic and its current reception and interpretation. Helle's style of translation is closer to literal, using spaces and special punctuation to mark passages that are uncertain or missing, in some ways like Anne Carson, but it's much more approachable for even first-time readers who don't yet have any sense of the plot than some of the other more rigorously scholarly translations. This one is a reading version. And the third book doesn't contain a new translation, but it works through the epic, tablet by tablet, comparing how various translators and readers have interpreted particular passages. I thought this book, called Gilgamesh, The Life of a Poem, was really fantastic. It was written by Michael Schmidt, a name many of you booktubers might recognize because of his authorship of the novel A Biography. Here he is ruminating on the possibilities and limitations of translation, especially as an iterative process. And I can imagine that those of you interested in translation more broadly, but not necessarily Gilgamesh specifically, might appreciate some of the sections in this book. I started this book late last night after I should have been heading off to sleep, and it is 150-something pages, so it fits for shorty September, as do most of these translations as well. Well, that will do it for today. Thanks, Michael K Vaughan, as well as your fellow Conan the Barbarian fans, including Steve Donahue, for inspiring me to participate in Sumerian September. And thanks to all of you for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.